Hello everyone and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content.
Today we look at one of the most notorious UK crime legends to ever exist in the UK criminal underworld. Viv Graham was born in 1959 to Hazel and Eric Graham, and he grew up in Highfield, Rowlands Gill, a village on the outskirts of Gateshead. After quitting his career as a successful amateur boxer, Mr. Graham became a doorman, eventually working with the well-known Gateshead hardman Billy Robinson and Paddy Leonard. With his irrefutable abilities, a talented 17-stone boxer who could bench press 520 pounds, he was soon operating a small army of doormen himself, and he protected various licensed premises in central Newcastle, Biker and Wallsend. Mr. Graham became a reputed organised crime figure in the city and was involved in high-level extortions and racketeering. In 1988, he was shot at during an incident that is believed to have been a revenge attack for an earlier unprovoked assault by Mr. Graham and a fellow bouncer, which left the victim with permanent injuries. Mr. Graham's activities brought him a very large income, occasionally in excess of £30,000 per week. Away from the worlds of bars and nightclubs or enforcement activities, Viv Graham would often frequent bookmakers and was well known for placing bets of over £1,000. However, if he wasn't at the bookmakers, it was also well known you could find Mr. Graham at Andy Webb's gym. He lived with girlfriend Anna Connolly in Walkerville, Newcastle upon Tyne with her children that she had from a previous relationship. Although they were unmarried, they were engaged, and he acted as stepfather to the children and they viewed him as their father. Miss Connolly's brother Peter was a pub owner in the Biker area of the city, and he would often be approached by fellow pub owners requiring the services of Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham became one of the most well-known and feared men of the northeast of England and earned a huge reputation amongst fellow criminals for extreme violence and showing no mercy on his enemies. This reputation over time was only increased further when Mr. Graham had annihilated several ever well-known Tyneside hardmen. This resulted in many more people staying clear of Mr. Graham without wanting any confrontation. Following an incident in which he was severely assaulted, rival doorman Stuart Watson, who himself had also a substantial reputation in the criminal underworld. During 1989, Mr. Graham was working with a dangerous criminal gang who had been refused access to a nightclub by the then head doorman Stuart Watson. Mr. Watson believed that the ruthless gang would show no respect to other revelers and would treat the place as if they owned it. Furthermore, he obviously wanted to preserve his own position and dominance over the club. Years later, Mr. Watson said of the incident, "I was just doing what I had to do to keep trouble out of the club. As a doorman, your job is to prevent any bad characters from getting in." Unable to intimidate the formidable Mr. Watson, the members of the gang subsequently left, but later returned to the club, accompanied by this time by Viv Graham and some of his associates. It is said that Mr. Graham had been deliberately misinformed about Mr. Watson's activities, and that he was wrongly told that Mr. Watson had made threats against him. The ruckus that ensued took place at the now demolished Hobo's nightclub in Newcastle and was later revealed to have been recorded on CCTV. Mr. Graham can be seen delivering multiple debilitating punches to Mr. Watson and throwing the 17-stone doorman around the reception area of the nightclub. This incident resulted in Mr. Graham's conviction and inevitable prison sentence in spite of his victim refusing to give any evidence against him. While serving his prison term, Mr. Graham took a keen interest in the case of Stephen Craven, who by then was serving a sentence for murdering Penny Lane in Newcastle Studio nightclub on the 24th of December 1989. Mr. Graham attempted to assist Mr. Craven, who possessed his innocence to this day. We will go into the story of Mr. Craven very soon, so stick around for that, guys, it's a really interesting one. The BBC programme Rough Justice covered the murder conviction in Murder at the Studio, which was first broadcast on the 1st of April 1997. Although he protests his innocence even to today, Mr. Craven's conviction still remains in place to this day. Upon Mr. Graham's release from prison, he broke all ties with his former Gangland associates, and by doing so, a prolonged bitter Gangland dispute ensued. It was also reported that he attempted to mend fences with the previously mentioned Mr. Watson. However, Mr. Graham was soon back in court for an assault in which he is said to have punched a man completely senseless. Around this time, various adversaries with their own agendas began working against Mr. Graham. He had confronted a gang member in a popular Newcastle nightclub about him supplying drugs in one of his establishments, and following a scuffle, the man escaped via the fire exit with Mr. Graham in hot pursuit. Many unsolicited confrontations were set up to try and catch Mr. Graham, one with a notorious, well-known, now deceased fighter that he avoided. He had also at this point survived several attempts on his life. Mr. Graham's apparent dislike of drugs and how he had seen them ruin lives and antagonize the gangs that had a vested interest in selling them. They wanted to expand their drugs enterprises across the city and make more money, but Mr. Graham's anti-drug stance was the only thing that stood in the way. Mr. Graham was aware of their plans to remove many of his men from the doors and pubs of the clubs of Newcastle. He was starting to receive death threats almost daily, and shortly before his death, a car drove past Mr. Graham's home, and one of the passengers leant out of the car and shot out the windows of his house. On Christmas Eve 1993, Mr. Graham was involved in another confrontation with another notorious gang in Newcastle. An attempt was made to remove Mr. Graham's firm from an establishment, but the attempt failed, as Mr. Graham, being there in person, repeatedly punched one of the gang members, breaking his jaw, whilst the other members made a hasty retreat. On New Year's Eve 1993, Viv Graham was ambushed whilst returning to his car, which he had parked in a side street at Wallsend High Street. The offside front window of his Ford Sierra Sapphire Cosworth had been broken, possibly to make him hesitate before entering the vehicle, or to activate the alarm so as Mr. Graham would return to the parked car. However, there is speculation as to whether this was done well before the shooting in a separate incident. He was shot 3 times by an unidentified gunman, one shot leaving a large hole in his back, but even after being left in such a bad shape, he still managed to drag himself back to Wallsend High Street, where he was found by a fellow bouncer, Terry Scott. In spite of him receiving 30 pints of blood, Viv Graham unfortunately died at North Tyneside General Hospital 4 hours later, just aged 34. He was later buried at Hookergate Cemetery. It was reported that he had received a telephone death threat just hours before he was shot, that Viv Graham had often told others that were close to him that he most probably wouldn't even get to C40, something that would later turn out to be true. He had curtailed the activities of several drug-based gangs by refusing them access to pubs and clubs that employed him, but maybe to his own downfall, he was known to never carry a firearm. The Northumbria police interviewed an informant who named the killer and confessed to his role as the getaway driver. In 2014, a police transcript was obtained by a local newspaper that outlined a police visit to a so-called supergrass whilst he was serving a prison sentence. During the visit, the informant watched a video and showed detectives a safe house, a bungalow in Heaton, which had been used by the hitman in the immediate aftermath of Mr. Graham's death. He then detailed his own involvement in the Notorious murder and named the gunman who allegedly murdered Mr. Graham. It is documented that he claimed to be in possession of a tape recording of the gunman admitting to the shooting, but he did not hand it over to the officers. He claimed to have stolen a Ford Escort from Berkeley to use for the shooting before travelling to Heaton. On the 31st of December in 1993, he picked up the gunman who said he was going to shoot Mr. Graham in the legs for retaliation for an ongoing dispute they had had. They went to Mr. Graham's house, but his car wasn't there, so they drove around Wallsend and soon discovered Mr. Graham's car parked just off Wallsend High Street. The stolen car was then parked with a view of the back of Mr. Graham's car. The gunman got out, walked over to Mr. Graham's car and smashed the driver's door window. When Mr. Graham returned to his vehicle, 3 shots were fired at him. The gunman ran back to the stolen Escort, got in, and the informant drove off. Once back in Heaton, the Escort was set alight and the pair were picked up by other criminal associates. The informant stated that the gunman had used a .357 Magnum. He stated that he believed the gunman was high on cocaine at the time of the shooting, and they both believed that Mr. Graham was only wounded, as he was last seen alive on all 4s beside his car. In 1998, Northumbria police questioned 5 men about an alleged conspiracy to murder the bouncer. In 2002, Tyneside career criminal Lee Sean Watson turned supergrass after he admitted the murder of Freddie Knights in Long Benton, Newcastle upon Tyne. During the Knights murder trial, the jury at Leeds Crown Court heard how Mr. Watson had told police who was responsible for the shooting of Mr. Graham. The court was also told after he was arrested for a separate offence in 1994 that Mr. Watson had boasted to police, "You couldn't catch us for shooting Viv Graham." But Mr. Watson's account is widely disputed. Mr. Graham's family offered a £100,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest and conviction of the killers. Over 500 homes were visited and some hundreds of statements were taken. In spite of these developments, no one has ever been brought to justice and the murder remains unsolved to this day. Viv Graham and the crimes he committed will never be forgotten in the UK criminal underworld. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe.